In the heart of the Amazon rainforest, where ancient trees stretch toward filtered sunlight and morning mist drifts like whispered secrets, something extraordinary happens each dawn. As the first light penetrates the canopy, the forest awakens with a phenomenon that has captivated human imagination for over 3,000 years. Here, in this cathedral of green, nature reveals one of her most remarkable gifts. Before we continue this journey, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story resonates with you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extraordinary for you. Consider for a moment the tree known to science as Hevea brasiliensis. To the untrained eye, it appears unremarkable among the countless species that populate this verdant realm. Yet within its bark lies a secret that would eventually transform human civilization itself. When the morning air carries just the right combination of humidity and temperature, when the sap pressure reaches its daily peak, these trees perform their daily miracle. The indigenous peoples of the Amazon discovered this wonder millennia ago. The Olmec civilization, flourishing more than 3,000 years past, understood something that would elude European minds for centuries. They knew precisely when to approach these towering sentinels, exactly how to make diagonal cuts in the bark without harming the living wood beneath. And then they witnessed what Spanish conquistadors would later describe as impossible. The tree began to weep. From these carefully carved wounds flows a substance unlike anything else in nature. Milky white, with the consistency of cream, this latex emerges like tears from the wounded bark. It is nature's own liquid bandage, designed to seal and protect. But the indigenous peoples recognized something far more profound in this flowing sap. They discovered that this mysterious liquid possessed properties that seemed to defy the natural world itself. Imagine witnessing this transformation for the first time. The Kayapo people developed techniques of extraordinary sophistication, passed down through countless generations. At dawn, when the forest stirred with life, they would visit their trees they knew as intimately as old friends. With practiced hands, they collected the precious latex in hollowed gourds, watching as the milky fluid gathered drop by precious drop. But the true magic began when they returned to their villages. Picture the scene: wooden paddles dipped into the fresh latex, then held carefully over fires fed by palm nuts and other aromatic woods. The smoke itself was crucial, carrying specific compounds that would interact with the latex in ways these people understood through generations of patient observation. Round and round they turned their paddles, watching as layer after translucent layer built upon itself. What emerged from this process defied everything Europeans thought they knew about materials. The latex had transformed into something that bounced like a living thing, stretched like skin, and repelled water with supernatural efficiency. Children played with balls that leaped and danced with impossible energy. Adults crafted boots that kept feet dry in the wettest climate on Earth, bottles that held water without leaking, torch handles that remained cool to the touch, even when flames blazed inches away. The substance seemed alive. It possessed a memory, returning to its original shape no matter how it was stretched or compressed. It breathed with the rhythm of the forest itself, expanding and contracting with temperature changes that would destroy other materials completely. This was not merely a useful substance, this was a miracle made manifest. When Spanish conquistadors first encountered these properties in 1536, their chroniclers struggled to find words that could capture what they witnessed. They watched indigenous children playing with balls that bounced, higher than a man could reach. They observed warriors wearing boots that emerged bone-dry from river crossings. They saw containers that held water yet weighed almost nothing. "Wood that weeps," they wrote, unable to comprehend the science behind what they observed. To European minds, accustomed to materials that followed predictable rules, rubber violated every principle of natural philosophy. Metal was hard and unyielding. Wood was rigid and fibrous. Cloth absorbed moisture. Yet here was something that combined the best properties of multiple materials while possessing characteristics that seemed utterly impossible. But nature, as she so often does, had built limitations into this gift. The substance that seemed magical in its jungle home revealed a fatal flaw when transported to different climates. European explorers spent centuries trying to harness this wonder material, shipping samples across the Atlantic with dreams of fortune dancing in their minds. What arrived in European ports bore little resemblance to the miraculous substance they had witnessed in the Amazon. The journey from tropical paradise to European warehouse became a tale of transformation and disappointment. In the holds of ships crossing the Atlantic, where temperatures fluctuated wildly and humidity levels varied from desert dry to tropical moist, the rubber began to change. The same properties that made it so remarkable in the Amazon, its sensitivity to heat and cold, its responsiveness to environmental conditions, became its greatest weakness. In London warehouses, the drama of rubber's temperature sensitivity played out with cruel consistency. During January's bitter cold, when frost painted windows with crystalline art, rubber products hardened into useless rigidity. Items that had been flexible as silk became brittle as old leather, cracking at the slightest touch. Boots became unwearable, bottles became unusable. The miracle material had transformed into expensive disappointment. Then came August's heat, and rubber's opposite extreme revealed itself with equal devastation. As temperatures soared and humidity turned the air thick as soup, rubber dissolved into foul-smelling chaos. The same boots that had cracked in winter cold now melted into sticky, putrid masses. The stench became overwhelming, a cloying, nauseating odor that permeated entire buildings. Workers fled from warehouses where fortunes literally dissolved before their eyes. This temperature sensitivity became rubber's curse. For decades, inventors and entrepreneurs across Europe and America pursued this elusive material with the dedication of alchemists seeking the philosopher's stone. They understood that whoever could tame rubber's wild nature would unlock fortunes beyond imagination. The applications seemed endless: waterproof clothing, flexible machinery components, airtight containers, but the solution remained as elusive as morning mist. Consider the frustration of those early pioneers. They held in their hands a substance that possessed properties no other material could match. Under perfect conditions, rubber could stretch to 8 times its original length and return completely to its original form. It could seal against water with perfect efficiency. It could absorb impacts that would shatter steel. Yet these same remarkable properties vanished the moment temperatures varied beyond a narrow range. The scientific principles behind rubber's behavior remained completely mysterious to 18th and early 19th century minds. They could not see the long chains of molecules that gave rubber its elasticity. They had no understanding of how these polymer chains behaved under different temperature conditions. They possessed no knowledge of the chemical bonds that held the substance together, or the molecular forces that caused it to fail under thermal stress. What they could observe with mounting frustration was the pattern. Cold made rubber brittle, heat made rubber sticky. There seemed to be no middle ground, no way to stabilize this mercurial material. Fortunes were lost in failed attempts to commercialize rubber products. Reputations crumbled along with rubber goods that failed spectacularly in real-world conditions. Yet the dream persisted. Somewhere in the back of every inventor's mind lurked the conviction that this problem had a solution. The indigenous peoples of the Amazon had worked with rubber for millennia. I reason, surely European ingenuity could unlock its secrets. The potential rewards were simply too enormous to abandon. Whoever conquered rubber's temperature sensitivity would revolutionize industry, transform commerce, and reshape the very foundations of human technology. This was the challenge that awaited one desperate American inventor, whose life had already been shattered by economic catastrophe. A man whose circumstances would force him to attempt what the greatest minds of his generation had declared impossible. His story begins not with triumph, but with failure so complete it would drive him to the very edge of despair. The stage was set for Charles Goodyear's unlikely triumph over impossible odds. In the rolling hills of Connecticut, where autumn maples paint the landscape in brilliant reds and golds, a different kind of story was unfolding. This was not the ancient tale of rubber trees and indigenous wisdom, but the very human drama of prosperity and its sudden, devastating loss. For it is often in our darkest moments that we discover capabilities we never knew we possessed. Charles Goodyear entered this world on December 29, 1800, in New Haven, Connecticut, blessed with every advantage that young America could offer. His father, Amasa Goodyear, had built a hardware business that embodied the industrious spirit of a growing nation. The Goodyear name carried weight throughout New England. Their farm implements helped settlers tame wilderness into fertile fields. Their household tools made daily life more manageable for countless families. Imagine the security of such a beginning. Charles inherited not merely a business, but a legacy of craftsmanship and reliability. At age 21, when most young men were still finding their way in the world, he stepped into ownership of an enterprise that seemed destined for continued growth. The Industrial Revolution was gathering momentum across America, creating endless opportunities for those with the vision to seize them. In 1824, Charles married Clarissa Beecher, a union that promised to cement his place in Connecticut's respectable society. By 1830, their household hummed with the comfortable rhythms of middle-class prosperity. Children's laughter echoed through well-appointed rooms. The future stretched ahead like a smooth, well-traveled road, predictable and promising. But consider how quickly fortune can turn. The American economy in the 1830s resembled a magnificent ship sailing through increasingly treacherous waters. Speculation had inflated land prices to impossible heights. Banks had extended credit with reckless abandon. The entire financial system balanced precariously on assumptions that tomorrow would always be more prosperous than today. When the storm finally broke in 1837, it did so with the sudden violence of a summer thunderstorm. The financial panic that swept across America destroyed businesses with the indiscriminate fury of a natural disaster. Banks collapsed overnight. Credit vanished, as if it had never existed. Fortunes that had taken generations to build evaporated in a matter of weeks. Charles Goodyear found himself caught in this maelstrom through no fault of his own. His investments in what had seemed like prudent ventures became worthless overnight. Customers who owed him money vanished, leaving unpaid debts that would never be collected. Suppliers demanded immediate payment for goods already delivered. The carefully constructed edifice of his business life crumbled with terrifying speed. Picture the moment when sheriff's deputies arrived at the Goodyear home. These were not faceless strangers but neighbors and acquaintances, men who knew Charles personally and felt the weight of their duty. Yet the law was merciless in its efficiency. Every possession the family owned, furniture that had graced their home for years, tools that represented the foundation of their livelihood, even personal items that held sentimental value beyond measure, was seized to satisfy creditors' demands. By 1838, Charles Goodyear found himself in a place that would have been unimaginable just months earlier. Debtors' prison was not merely a place of confinement, but a living symbol of social disgrace. Here, men who had once commanded respect now lived in squalid conditions. Their only crime, the inability to pay debts that circumstances beyond their control had made impossible to satisfy. The prison itself was a testament to humanity's capacity for cruelty disguised as justice. Overcrowded cells reeked of unwashed bodies and despair. Men who had once been merchants, craftsmen, and farmers now shared space with common criminals, their dignity stripped away along with their freedom. Some had been confined for years, their debts growing larger through accumulated interest while their ability to earn money remained completely eliminated. In this environment, where hope seemed as foreign as sunlight in a windowless cell, most men simply endured. They played cards with decks worn smooth by countless hands. They stared at walls stained by the passage of countless defeated souls. They waited for salvation that might never come, growing older and more broken with each passing day. But Charles Goodyear possessed something that distinguished him from his fellow prisoners. Whether it was desperation, determination, or simple inability to accept defeat, he refused to surrender to circumstances. His mind continued to work, to plan, to imagine possibilities that extended beyond his current degradation. And then fate presented him with the opportunity that would change everything. His wife, Clarissa, bless her devoted heart, made regular visits to the prison despite the social stigma such associations carried. During one such visit, she brought news that seemed insignificant at the time, but would prove to be the spark that ignited Goodyear's obsession. A local store, she mentioned almost casually, had begun displaying samples of rubber products imported from South America. Consider the effect such news might have on a mind already pushed to its breaking point. Here was Goodyear, stripped of everything he had built, confined in conditions that would test the strongest spirit. Yet instead of driving him deeper into despair, this casual mention of rubber products awakened something powerful within him. Perhaps it was the inventor's instinct that had been dormant during his years of conventional business success. Perhaps it was simply the desperate hope of a drowning man grasping at any potential salvation. Whatever the source of his motivation, Goodyear became consumed with thoughts of rubber and its possibilities. He had heard, as had most informed Americans, of the wonderful properties this substance displayed in its native environment. He knew of the frustrating failures that had befallen every attempt to commercialize rubber products in temperate climates. Where others saw an unsolvable problem, his desperate circumstances allowed him to see an opportunity. With a conviction that must have seemed like madness to his fellow prisoners, Goodyear convinced Clarissa to sacrifice some of her few remaining possessions to purchase rubber samples for his examination. Picture this devoted woman, already struggling to maintain even minimal living conditions for herself and their children, selling precious items so that her imprisoned the husband could pursue what appeared to be a hopeless fantasy. The prison guards, perhaps moved by pity or simple curiosity, allowed Goodyear to conduct primitive experiments using tools from the prison workshop. While other inmates resigned themselves to waiting out their sentences, Charles began the work that would define the rest of his life. In conditions that would challenge the most dedicated scientist, using equipment that barely deserved the name, he began his systematic assault on rubber's mysterious properties. His approach demonstrated the methodical thinking that had once made him a successful businessman. Despite his desperate circumstances, despite the distractions of prison life, despite having access to only the most basic materials, Goodyear began testing rubber's behavior under different conditions. He mixed it with available chemicals, subjected it to heat and cold, observed its reactions with the intensity of a scholar studying ancient texts. The other prisoners, he watched this strange behavior with a mixture of amusement and concern. Here was a man who had lost everything, confined in one of society's most degrading institutions, yet he worked with the focused intensity of someone who believed absolutely in the possibility of salvation through scientific discovery. Some thought him mad. Others simply pitied him. Few understood that they were witnessing the birth of one of history's most important technological breakthroughs. But in that dank prison cell, surrounded by the sounds of human suffering and despair, Charles Goodyear was laying the foundation for work that would eventually transform human civilization. Every failed experiment was a step toward understanding. Every observation, no matter how seemingly insignificant, added to his growing knowledge of rubber's behavior. He was, without knowing it, beginning a journey that would lead from the depths of personal defeat to heights of achievement that would benefit all humanity. The irony that was profound. In losing everything he had built, Charles Goodyear found himself free to pursue something far greater. Prison walls that confined his body had paradoxically liberated his mind to explore possibilities that prosperity's distractions had kept hidden. Sometimes, it seems, we must lose ourselves completely before we can discover who we truly are. His fellow prisoners could not have imagined that they were witnessing the beginning of a quest that would consume decades, destroy his health, impoverish his family repeatedly, and ultimately create one of the most important materials in human history. They saw only a broken man clinging to an impossible dream. What they could not see was the birth of an obsession so powerful it would prove stronger than poverty, stronger than failure, stronger even than the repeated warnings of those who loved him most. The stage was now set for the next phase of Charles Goodyear's extraordinary journey, essai, his transformation from imprisoned debtor to obsessed inventor, pursuing a dream that would lead him through years of spectacular failures toward an accidental discovery that would change the world forever. Freedom from prison brought Charles Goodyear not relief, but merely a change of venue for his obsession. Released into a world that still viewed him as a failed businessman, carrying debts that seemed impossible to repay, he faced a choice that would define the remainder of his life. He could accept defeat and seek conventional employment to slowly rebuild his shattered existence. Or he could pursue the impossible dream that had sustained him through the darkest days of imprisonment. The choice, perhaps, was never really his to make. The rubber experiments had awakened something within him that could not be quieted by practical considerations or family obligations. Like a naturalist who has glimpsed a new species and cannot rest until it is properly studied and catalogued, Goodyear had seen possibilities in rubber that others had missed or abandoned as hopeless. The Goodyear home became the stage for one of history's most remarkable transformations. What had once been the kitchen of a respectable Connecticut family evolved into something between a laboratory and a battlefield. Here, surrounded by the ordinary implements of domestic life, Charles would wage his war against the laws of chemistry and physics that made rubber such a maddening material. Consider the scene that greeted visitors to the Goodyear household during those extraordinary years. The kitchen, once the domain of family meals and gentle conversation, now resembled the workshop of an alchemist gone mad. Tables groaned under the weight of rubber samples in various stages of experimentation. Shelves held bottles and containers filled with every conceivable chemical compound that Goodyear could acquire through purchase, borrowing, or simple ingenuity. The air itself told the story of relentless experimentation. Acrid fumes from failed chemical reactions mingled with the sulphurous smell of burning rubber. Neighbors learned to close their windows when the wind blew from the direction of the Goodyear house. The very atmosphere around the building became a testament to the intensity of the work being conducted within. His 5 children, Ellen, Clarissa, Cynthia, Charles Jr., and William, adapted to this extraordinary environment with the resilience that children somehow possess. They learned to recognize the warning signs that preceded their father's more dangerous experiments. The sound of certain chemicals being mixed meant it was time to retreat to the furthest corners of the house. The sight of particular apparatus being assembled signaled the need to open every window and door regardless of weather. Picture these children, ranging in age from toddlers to teenagers, growing up in an environment where scientific discovery and family life intertwined in the most intimate ways. They learned to dodge flying fragments when rubber samples exploded under pressure. They developed the reflexes to flee choking chemical fumes that could fill a room in seconds. Their childhood games were punctuated by the crash of glassware and their father's exclamations of either triumph or despair. For Clarissa Goodyear, watching her husband pursue this obsession must have required reserves of patience and faith that tested the very foundations of marriage. She had already sacrificed her security, her social standing, and her material comfort for Charles's business failures. Now, she watched him pour their few remaining resources into experiments that seemed to bring only more poverty and social isolation. Yet there was method in what appeared to be madness. Goodyear approached his rubber experiments with the systematic thinking that had once made him a successful businessman. He maintained detailed records of every attempt, documenting not only what worked, but, perhaps more importantly, what failed and why. Each disaster taught him something new about rubber's behavior under different conditions. He began with the obvious approaches that had occurred to countless inventors before him. Bronze powder mixed with rubber created beautiful metallic green compounds that seemed promising until temperature changes revealed their fundamental instability. Acids dissolved rubber entirely, teaching him about the molecular bonds that held the material together. Magnesia created chalk-white mixtures that looked professional but cracked with the first frost. The failures accumulated with devastating consistency, yet each one eliminated a possibility and pointed toward new avenues of exploration. Rubber treated with nitric acid showed remarkable properties for weeks, leading Goodyear to believe he had achieved his breakthrough. Then summer's heat arrived, and the treated rubber transformed into putrid, stinking slime that attracted flies and nauseated everyone within a considerable rubber radius. Lead oxide combinations produced rubber that gleamed with beautiful colors and seemed to maintain stability across moderate temperature ranges. Winter's deeper cold, however, revealed the fundamental weakness in this approach. The rubber became brittle as glass, cracking at the slightest touch and crumbling into useless fragments that no amount of heat could restore to flexibility. Each failure carried not only scientific disappointment, but financial catastrophe. The chemicals Goodyear needed for his experiments cost money the family desperately needed for food and shelter. Every rubber sample represented a choice between scientific pursuit and family welfare. Clarissa watched their children grow thinner as their father's obsession consumed resources that should have provided basic nutrition. The neighbors' reactions ranged from pity to outright hostility. The constant explosions, the toxic fumes, the strange smells that emanated from the Goodyear house at all hours made the family pariahs in their own community. Local children dared each other to peer through windows at the mad inventor, whose experiments shook buildings and poisoned the air. But within the chaos of failed experiments, something significant was happening. Goodyear was learning rubber's secrets through a process of systematic elimination that no university laboratory could have provided. His kitchen had become a place where theoretical chemistry met practical desperation, where the need for success drove innovation beyond the boundaries of conventional scientific method. The breakthrough moment came not through careful planning, but through the kind of accidental observation that separates great inventors from merely competent ones. Among the hundreds of chemical combinations Goodyear had tested, sulfur showed particularly interesting effects. When mixed with rubber, sulfur created changes in texture and flexibility that seemed more promising than other additives. By 1839, Goodyear's kitchen contained hundreds of sulfur rubber samples in various stages of testing. He had learned to heat these mixtures carefully, observing how temperature affected their properties. He had documented the optimal ratios of sulfur to rubber for different applications. He had even begun to suspect that heat itself might be the key to stabilizing rubber's mercurial nature. What he had not yet discovered was the precise combination of temperature, time, and chemical composition that would create the stable material he sought. That discovery waited just months in the future, hidden in an accidental spill that would occur on one of winter's bitterest days. But already, in those endless days and nights of experimentation, Charles Goodyear was approaching the solution to a problem that had frustrated the greatest minds of his generation. His systematic approach, born of desperation and sustained by unwavering determination, had brought him closer to success than any of his more conventionally educated competitors. The kitchen laboratory had become a place where human persistence met natural law, where failure taught lessons more valuable than any textbook could provide. Here, in the midst of domestic chaos and financial ruin, The foundations were being laid for one of history's most important technological breakthroughs. His children learned to sleep through explosions and wake to the smell of sulfur. His wife learned to distinguish between the fumes that meant danger and those that simply meant another failed experiment. His neighbors learned to avoid the Goodyear house when the wind blew their direction. But none of them, not his family, not his neighbors, not even Charles himself, could have imagined that they were witnessing the final preparations for a discovery that would transform human civilization. The stage was set, the materials were prepared, and the inventor had acquired through bitter experience the knowledge that would soon make accidental discovery possible. In that cluttered kitchen, surrounded by the debris of countless failed experiments, Charles Goodyear was about to stumble upon the secret that would make his name immortal and change the world forever. On a bitter February morning in 1839, when winter held Massachusetts in its iron grip and breath hung like smoke in the frigid air, the course of human history was about to change forever. Yet nothing in that moment suggested the magnitude of what was about to unfold. Charles Goodyear stood in his Woburn kitchen, surrounded by the familiar chaos of his experiments, holding in his hands what appeared to be just another failed attempt to tame rubber's impossible nature. The sample he examined that morning represented months of painstaking work. It was a mixture of rubber, sulfur, and white lead, components he had combined countless times before in different proportions and under varying conditions. This particular specimen felt different from pure rubber, exhibiting a flexibility that seemed more stable than previous attempts. Yet it remained, like all his other experiments, fundamentally unreliable when exposed to temperature extremes. Standing with him in the kitchen was a visitor, a neighbor perhaps, or a potential investor, someone skeptical of Goodyear's claims about rubber's potential. Picture the scene, the inventor gesturing enthusiastically about his latest discovery, trying to convince yet another doubter that success lay just within reach. His hands moved expressively as he spoke, the rubber sample dancing between his fingers as he demonstrated its properties. And then, in one of those moments that separate the ordinary from the extraordinary, accident intervened where design had failed. The sample flew from Goodyear's gesticulating hand with the casual unpredictability that characterizes so many great discoveries. It arced through the air and landed with a soft impact on the red-hot surface of his wood-burning stove. What happened next defied every principle that 5 years of experimentation had taught him. Instead of melting into the sticky, formless mess that heat invariably produced, instead of charring into brittle fragments that cold weather created, something miraculous occurred. The rubber began to char around its edges, as expected, but the center remained flexible, elastic, fundamentally unchanged by the intense heat. Consider the electricity of such a moment. Goodyear scraped the sample from the stove with hands that must have trembled with barely controlled excitement. The heated rubber felt unlike anything he had encountered in hundreds of experiments. It stretched without breaking, returning to its original shape with the resilience of living tissue. Even as it cooled in the winter air, it maintained properties that combined the best characteristics of rubber with a stability that had previously seemed impossible. But one of the most remarkable aspects of great discoveries is how they often appear unremarkable to outside observers. The visitor in Goodyear's kitchen that day witnessed what might be considered the most important accidental discovery in the history of materials science, yet probably left thinking only that the strange inventor's latest experiment had produced another odd-looking failure. Goodyear himself understood immediately that something unprecedented had occurred, yet he possessed enough scientific caution to resist premature celebration. Too many previous experiments had seemed successful initially, only to fail spectacularly when subjected to rigorous testing. This sample would need to prove itself under conditions that had destroyed every previous attempt. That night, while his family slept and the February wind howled through bare trees, Charles Goodyear conducted the test that would determine whether his accidental discovery represented genuine breakthrough or merely another false hope. He nailed the sample to the outside of his house, exposing it directly to winter's most severe conditions. Temperatures that night plummeted well below freezing, creating conditions that had shattered every previous rubber compound like fragile glass. Dawn arrived with the pale light that characterizes New England winters, filtering through clouds that promised more snow before the day ended. Goodyear rushed outside with his heart pounding against his ribs, hardly daring to examine what the night's cold had done to his sample. What he found there changed not only his life, but the trajectory of human technological development. The rubber remained perfectly elastic. Despite temperatures that had reached -10 degrees Fahrenheit, despite exposure to wind and moisture that had destroyed countless previous attempts, the sample stretched and rebounded exactly as it had the previous day. For the first time in 5 years of relentless experimentation, Charles Goodyear held in his hands a piece of rubber that maintained its remarkable properties regardless of environmental conditions. He had accidentally discovered vulcanization, though he would not understand the scientific principles behind his breakthrough for years to come. What had occurred on that hot stove surface was a chemical transformation so elegant, so perfectly suited to rubber's molecular structure, that it seems almost as if nature had designed the process specifically to solve rubber's greatest weakness. The science behind vulcanization reveals the beauty inherent in chemical processes. Natural rubber consists of long chains of isoprene molecules, polymers, that give the material its characteristic elasticity by allowing molecular chains to stretch and return to their original positions. However, these same chains can slide past each other when heated, causing rubber to become sticky and formless, or become rigid when cooled, making the material brittle and useless. Sulfur atoms, when activated by heat reaching precisely 320 degrees Fahrenheit, perform a molecular miracle. They form chemical bridges, crosslinks, between rubber's polymer chains at regular intervals, typically every 50 to 100 molecular units. These crosslinks create a three-dimensional network that fundamentally changes rubber's behavior under temperature stress. Picture this transformation at the molecular level. The sulfur atoms act like molecular rivets, holding the polymer chains in proper relationship to each other, while still allowing the flexibility that makes rubber useful. When vulcanized rubber is stretched, the polymer chains elongate but cannot slide past each other permanently because the sulfur crosslinks prevent such movement. When the stretching force is removed, the crosslinks pull the chains back to their original positions. This molecular architecture explains why vulcanized rubber maintains elasticity across extreme temperature ranges. The crosslinks remain stable from -40 degrees Fahrenheit to +160 degrees Fahrenheit, creating a material that behaves consistently whether installed in Arctic equipment or desert machinery. The transformation represents one of nature's most elegant solutions to a complex engineering problem. But understanding the chemistry was far less important to Goodyear in that moment than recognizing the magnitude of his achievement. He had created the world's first truly stable elastic material, solving a problem that had frustrated inventors and entrepreneurs for centuries. The applications that immediately suggested themselves were staggering in their scope and potential. Waterproof clothing that would remain flexible in any weather, machinery gaskets that would maintain perfect seals despite temperature fluctuations, containers that could hold liquids or gases under pressure without leaking, transportation systems that could benefit from materials combining strength with flexibility. The possibilities seemed to stretch as endlessly as the rubber sample in his hands. Yet even in this moment of triumph, Charles Goodyear faced the challenge that confronts every inventor who makes a breakthrough discovery. He possessed a material with revolutionary properties, but he lacked the resources to develop it commercially. His years of experimentation had consumed every penny the family owned and borrowed beyond. He had solved the technical problem but remained as poor as ever. Moreover, the vulcanization process itself required optimization before it could become commercially viable. The accidental spill had demonstrated that the combination of sulfur, rubber, and heat could create stable elastic material, but Goodyear still needed to determine optimal proportions, precise temperatures, and timing that would enable consistent results in manufacturing settings. The work ahead would require years of additional experimentation, countless refinements to the basic process, and somehow finding financial backing despite his reputation as an impractical dreamer. But the fundamental breakthrough had occurred. In that moment, when rubber met heat on a February morning, the foundation had been laid for technologies that would transform transportation, medicine, manufacturing, and countless other aspects of human civilization. Standing in his kitchen that morning, examining a piece of rubber that had survived winter's worst assault while maintaining perfect elasticity, Charles Goodyear held the future in his hands. He possessed the solution to a problem that had seemed unsolvable, the key to unlocking rubber's potential for applications that would benefit all humanity. The accidental discovery was complete. Now began the longer, more challenging task of transforming that moment of scientific breakthrough into practical technologies that would change the world forever. But in rubber's molecular structure, sulfur atoms had found their perfect partner, creating cross-linked networks that would prove stronger than poverty, more persistent than failure, more enduring than the man who discovered them. The age of vulcanized rubber had begun. The transformation that followed Charles Goodyear's discovery unfolded with the inexorable force of a river breaking through a dam. What began as an accidental spill in a Massachusetts kitchen became the foundation for changes that would reshape every aspect of human civilization. Consider how profound this moment was. For the first time in history, humanity possessed a material that combined elasticity with stability, opening possibilities that previous generations could never have imagined. Yet the path from discovery to global transformation proved neither straight nor simple. Goodyear's breakthrough occurred in 1839, but the full flowering of rubber's potential required decades of development, refinement, and the convergence of multiple technological advances. Like seeds scattered by wind, his discovery needed the right conditions: entrepreneurial vision, manufacturing capability, and societal needs to grow into the mighty industry that would eventually employ millions. The first applications emerged tentatively, almost cautiously, as if the world needed time to comprehend the magnitude of what had become possible. Waterproof shoes appeared in 1848, nearly a decade after Goodyear's discovery. Picture the revelation these represented to people who had never owned footwear that remained comfortable and protective in wet conditions. For the first time in human history, feet could stay dry while walking through puddles, crossing streams, or working in damp environments. But waterproof shoes were merely the beginning. The true genius of vulcanized rubber lay in its combination of properties that seemed contradictory yet complementary. It was flexible enough to bend without breaking, yet strong enough to maintain its shape under stress. It was elastic enough to stretch dramatically, yet stable enough to return consistently to its original form. It was soft enough to provide comfort, yet durable enough to withstand years of hard use. Railroad development provided the first large-scale application that demonstrated rubber's strategic importance. As steam locomotives grew larger and more powerful during the 1850s, engineers faced increasingly complex challenges in creating reliable braking systems. Traditional materials could not withstand the combination of heat, pressure, and constant flexing that railroad operations demanded. Vulcanized rubber gaskets solved these problems with elegant efficiency. They created perfect air seals in pneumatic braking systems while maintaining flexibility through thousands of compression cycles. They remained stable, whether trains operated in summer heat that could reach 120 degrees Fahrenheit or winter cold that plummeted to -20 degrees Fahrenheit below. zero. For the first time, railroad engineers possessed a material that could match the demanding requirements of their expanding transportation networks. Telegraph systems presented similar challenges that rubber uniquely addressed. As communication networks extended across continents and beneath oceans, engineers needed insulation materials that could protect electrical signals from moisture, while remaining flexible enough to handle installation and environmental stresses. Vulcanized rubber provided the perfect solution, enabling telegraph cables to carry messages reliably across thousands of miles of harsh terrain. Picture the first transatlantic telegraph cable, laid in 1858 after multiple failures with inadequate insulation materials. Every mile of that cable was wrapped in vulcanized rubber that had been precisely formulated to resist seawater corrosion while maintaining electrical properties under crushing deep ocean pressure. When the first message crossed, from America to Europe in minutes rather than weeks, rubber technology made that miracle possible. But perhaps no application demonstrated rubber's transformative power more dramatically than the development of pneumatic tires. When John Boyd Dunlop invented the air-filled tire in 1888, he created a device that fundamentally changed humanity's relationship with transportation. However, his invention would have remained a curious novelty without vulcanized rubber's unique properties. Consider the engineering challenges that pneumatic tires presented. They needed to maintain air pressure while flexing millions of times during their service lives. They required strength to resist punctures from road debris while remaining soft enough to provide comfortable rides. They had to function reliably, whether installed on bicycles traveling 10 miles per hour or carriages moving at 20 miles per hour or faster. Each tire contained precisely measured sulfur, crosslinks, distributed throughout its rubber structure. These molecular connections prevented punctures by giving the rubber enough strength to resist penetration by small, sharp objects. Simultaneously, the crosslink network maintained elasticity essential for absorbing road shock and providing traction on varied surfaces. No other material in existence could have met these contradictory requirements. The bicycle boom of the 1890s demonstrated rubber's economic potential on an unprecedented scale. Suddenly, ordinary people could travel distances that had previously required horses or expensive railroad tickets. Young people could court across greater distances. Workers could live farther from their employment. Rural families could access previously distant markets and social opportunities. By 1900, rubber factories employed hundreds of thousands of workers across America and Europe. These manufacturing complexes consumed enormous quantities of raw materials, not just rubber and sulfur, but the cotton and steel wire that reinforced finished products. Entire cities grew around rubber manufacturing, creating communities whose prosperity depended entirely on Goodyear's accidental discovery decades earlier. The automotive revolution that began in the early 1900s proved that rubber had become absolutely essential to modern transportation. Henry Ford's Model T, which democratized automobile ownership starting in 1908, required 4 rubber tires, plus dozens of rubber gaskets, hoses, and seals throughout its mechanical systems. Without vulcanized rubber, the internal combustion engine would have remained an interesting laboratory curiosity rather than the foundation for a transportation revolution. 2 world wars revealed rubber's strategic importance with terrifying clarity. Military planners discovered that modern warfare was impossible without reliable access to rubber supplies. Aircraft required tires capable of repeated landings at speeds exceeding 100 miles per hour. Each landing subjected tires to forces that would destroy any other material, yet vulcanized rubber handled these stresses routinely while maintaining the flexibility necessary for safe operations. Submarines presented even more extreme requirements. Operating hundreds of feet below the ocean surface, submarines depended on rubber gaskets that could maintain perfect seals under pressures that would crush steel. A single gasket failure could flood a submarine in minutes, drowning entire crews. The molecular crosslinks that Goodyear had accidentally discovered provided the only technology capable of creating seals reliable enough for underwater warfare. Tank warfare demonstrated rubber's versatility under combat conditions. Tank tracks incorporated rubber pads that prevented steel from grinding directly against stone roads, reducing wear while maintaining traction across varied terrain. These rubber components had to function reliably while subjected to the constant vibration and impact of cross-country travel, often under enemy fire and in extreme weather conditions. When Japan captured Southeast Asian rubber plantations during World War II, Allied forces faced strategic catastrophe. Military leaders realized that without rubber, modern warfare became impossible. Aircraft could not fly safely. Ships could not operate their mechanical systems reliably. Ground vehicles could not function effectively. The war effort itself depended on materials science that traced directly back to Charles Goodyear's kitchen experiments. The medical revolution that followed demonstrated rubber's potential for saving human lives. Surgical gloves made from vulcanized rubber enabled sterile operations by creating effective barriers against infection while maintaining the dexterity surgeons required for delicate procedures. Before rubber gloves, surgical mortality rates remained catastrophically high because doctors could not to prevent bacterial contamination during operations. Rubber tubing revolutionized medical treatment by enabling intravenous medication delivery and anesthesia systems that made complex surgery possible. These applications required materials that could flex repeatedly without cracking, resist degradation from medical chemicals, and maintain dimensional stability under varying pressure conditions. Vulcanized rubber met all these requirements while remaining cost-effective enough for widespread medical use. Artificial heart valves, kidney dialysis machines, and respiratory equipment all depended on rubber components engineered to interface with human biological systems. These medical devices required materials that could function reliably for years while maintaining biocompatibility that prevented adverse reactions in patients. The molecular stability that vulcanization provided made such life-sustaining technologies practical for the first time in medical history. By the mid-20th century, rubber had become so thoroughly integrated into human civilization that its absence would have caused immediate societal collapse. Transportation systems, manufacturing equipment, medical devices, communications networks, and countless consumer products all depended on materials that traced their existence to that February morning when Charles Goodyear accidentally dropped a rubber sample onto his kitchen stove. The empire that rose from Goodyear's discovery employed millions of workers, supported entire cities, and generated technologies that improved the quality of life for people around the world. Yet this remarkable transformation also carried consequences that Goodyear himself could never have anticipated. Consequences that would challenge humanity's relationship with the natural world and force difficult questions about the true cost of technological progress. From a single moment of accidental discovery had grown an industry that touched every aspect of human existence, demonstrating the profound power of scientific breakthrough to reshape civilization itself. As rubber's influence spread across the globe like ripples from a stone thrown into still water, its wake carried consequences that Charles Goodyear could never have foreseen. The same discovery that promised to improve human life also unleashed forces of exploitation and environmental destruction that would scar entire continents. In nature, every gift comes with a price, and rubber's gift to humanity demanded payment in human suffering and ecological devastation on an almost unimaginable scale. The transformation began innocently enough with growing demand for the miraculous material that Goodyear's discovery had made practical. As pneumatic tires, waterproof clothing, and industrial applications consumed ever-increasing quantities of rubber, the Amazon rainforest became the focus of global economic forces that cared nothing for the indigenous peoples who had discovered rubber's secrets thousands of years earlier. The period from 1879 to 1912 became known as the Rubber Fever, an era when European and American companies extracted wealth from the Amazon with the systematic efficiency of colonial exploitation. Picture the contrast between rubber's peaceful origins among the Kayapo and Olmec peoples and the brutal industrial extraction that followed Goodyear's breakthrough. Rubber barons emerged as the new conquistadors of the Amazon, wielding economic power that dwarfed political authority across vast territories. Julio Cesar Arana, perhaps the most notorious of these figures, controlled territories larger than many European nations. His Peruvian Amazon company ruled over approximately 50,000 square miles of rainforest, governing a population of indigenous peoples who found themselves transformed overnight from free communities into captive labor forces. The methods these companies employed reveal the dark side of technological progress. Indigenous peoples who had lived sustainably in the rainforest for millennia suddenly faced forced quotas that turned rubber collection from seasonal work into desperate survival. Children as young as 8 years old were required to collect daily quantities of latex that would challenge healthy adults. Entire families worked from dawn to dusk, tapping trees and processing rubber under conditions that approach slavery in everything but name. Consider the numbers that document this human catastrophe. During the rubber boom's peak, the Amazon's indigenous population collapsed from approximately 1 million to fewer than 300,000 people. This represented not merely economic displacement, but near genocide carried out in pursuit of the material that Goodyear's discovery had made globally valuable. Entire tribal groups vanished completely from regions where they had lived for countless generations. The Huitoto people, who numbered perhaps 50,000 before the rubber boom, were reduced to fewer than 10,000 survivors. The Bora and Andoke peoples suffered similar devastation as disease, violence, and forced labor decimated communities that had maintained sophisticated ecological knowledge for centuries. The enforcement methods that maintained these brutal quotas defy human comprehension. Families who failed to meet impossible latex collection targets faced flogging, mutilation, or death. Company agents burned villages that showed signs of resistance. They took hostages to ensure compliance, separating children from parents and husbands from wives with calculated cruelty designed to prevent organized opposition. British consul Roger Casement's reports from this period document atrocities that shocked even colonial-era sensibilities. Workers who delivered insufficient latex were tortured with devices that company officials designed specifically for maximum pain. Others were simply executed as examples to maintain terror among the remaining population. The pursuit of rubber had transformed the Amazon into a hell that contradicted every principle of human dignity. But even as this exploitation reached its peak, the seeds of its own destruction were already spreading across the world's oceans. In 1876, British agent Henry Wickham accomplished one of history's most consequential acts of biopiracy when he smuggled 70,000 rubber seeds out of Brazil aboard the steamship Amazonas. Wickham's theft broke South America's natural monopoly over rubber production and enabled the development of massive plantation agriculture across Southeast Asia. British colonial authorities recognized rubber's strategic importance and invested enormous resources in establishing plantations throughout Malaysia, Ceylon, and other tropical territories under their control. These plantations represented a different form of environmental destruction, one that operated with industrial efficiency rather than desperate exploitation. Millions of acres of Southeast Asian rainforest were cleared to make room for rubber monocultures that eliminated biodiversity. Evolved over millions of years, complex ecosystems that supported thousands of species were replaced by single-species efficiency designed purely for latex production. The ecological consequences of this transformation proved as devastating as the human costs of Amazonian exploitation. Traditional farming communities found themselves displaced by rubber cultivation that offered short-term profits but destroyed soil fertility within decades. Local food production collapsed as land use shifted entirely toward export crops that fed global industrial demand rather than local nutritional needs. Cultural knowledge that had accumulated over centuries vanished, along with the communities that possessed it. Indigenous peoples across Southeast Asia had developed sophisticated understanding of forest ecology, sustainable harvesting practices, and medicinal plant usage that represented libraries of wisdom accumulated through countless generations of careful observation. This knowledge disappeared as communities abandoned traditional ways of life for wage labor in plantations designed according to European industrial models. The environmental damage extended far beyond the plantations themselves. Rubber cultivation required enormous quantities of water for processing latex, leading to the contamination of rivers and streams that had previously supported diverse aquatic ecosystems. Chemical fertilizers and pesticides used to maximize plantation yields poisoned soil and groundwater across vast areas, creating dead zones where few species could survive. Consider the bitter irony of this transformation. Rubber had evolved as part of complex rainforest ecosystems where it played crucial ecological roles. The latex that trees produced served as protection against insect damage and wound healing, supporting the biodiversity that made rainforests the most productive ecosystems on Earth. When humans transformed rubber into monoculture plantations, they destroyed the very ecological relationships that had created the material they sought to exploit. The social disruption extended far beyond plantation boundaries, as global rubber markets created boom and bust cycles that devastated entire regions. When demand increased, plantations expanded rapidly, drawing workers from traditional communities and disrupting agricultural systems that had sustained local populations for generations. When market prices collapsed, as they inevitably did when supply exceeded demand, entire regions faced economic catastrophe that left communities without viable livelihoods. World War II revealed another dimension of rubber's strategic importance when military demands created artificial scarcity that affected civilian populations worldwide. Tire rationing in the United States forced millions of people to abandon private automobiles, while industries that depended on rubber components struggled to maintain production. The war demonstrated how thoroughly modern civilization had become dependent on a material that remained vulnerable to military disruption. The medical applications that saved countless lives also created new forms of environmental contamination, as disposable rubber products accumulated in landfills and waterways. Surgical gloves, tubing, and other medical devices that protected human health became sources of pollution that affected ecosystems around the world. The same stability that made vulcanized rubber so useful also made it virtually indestructible, creating waste streams that would persist for centuries. Labor conditions in rubber plantations across Southeast Asia mirrored many of the abuses that had characterized Amazonian exploitation. Indentured workers faced dangerous exposure to chemicals used in latex processing, while plantation owners prioritized profit over worker safety. The prosperity that rubber brought to colonial administrators and plantation owners came at the cost of environmental degradation and human suffering that would persist long after independence movements ended formal colonial control. By the mid-20th century, the true cost of rubber's transformation from indigenous discovery to global commodity had become apparent. The material that had promised to improve human life had also demonstrated humanity's capacity to pursue technological progress without regard for environmental consequences or social justice. The same molecular crosslinks that made vulcanized rubber so useful had created economic and ecological relationships that proved far more difficult to break. Yet even in the face of these sobering realities, rubber's benefits to human civilization remained undeniable. Medical devices saved lives, transportation systems enabled global commerce, and industrial applications supported technologies that improved living standards for millions of people. The challenge was not to abandon rubber, but to develop more sustainable relationships with the natural systems that made its production possible. The shadows cast by liquid gold served as a reminder that every technological breakthrough carries the potential for both blessing and curse, depending on how humanity chooses to harness the power of discovery. In the laboratories of the 21st century, where scientists manipulate matter at the atomic level and design materials with precision that would have seemed magical to Charles Goodyear, rubber continues its remarkable evolution. The accidental discovery that began in a Massachusetts kitchen has grown into a sophisticated science that pushes the boundaries of what materials can achieve. Yet remarkably, the fundamental principles that Goodyear stumbled upon remain the foundation for innovations that extend far beyond anything he could have imagined. Modern rubber science represents a perfect synthesis of ancient wisdom and cutting-edge technology. Researchers now understand exactly why that February morning's accident produced such extraordinary results. They can see the molecular dance of sulfur atoms forming crosslinks between polymer chains, and they have learned to choreograph this dance with exquisite precision to create materials with properties that seem to border on science fiction. Consider the marvel of shape memory rubber, a material that remembers its original form with the fidelity of living tissue. When heated to specific temperatures, these specially formulated compounds automatically return to predetermined configurations, enabling everything from self-adjusting automobile components to medical devices that deploy inside the human body. The molecular mechanisms that enable this remarkable behavior trace directly back to Goodyear's discovery of vulcanization, refined through decades of research into the precise relationships between temperature, chemical composition, and molecular structure. Picture a cardiac stent made from shape memory rubber, compressed into a tiny cylinder for insertion through blood vessels, then programmed to expand into a perfect support structure when it reaches body temperature. The same cross-linking principles that Goodyear accidentally discovered now enable life-saving medical interventions that require materials capable of transforming themselves with clockwork precision inside living patients. Self-healing rubber represents another extraordinary advance that builds upon vulcanization's fundamental insights. These materials contain embedded microcapsules filled with repair compounds that automatically activate when the rubber suffers damage. A small puncture triggers the release of healing agents that flow into the wound and polymerize, creating new crosslinks that restore the material's original properties. This technology promises to revolutionize tire safety by enabling vehicles to continue operating safely even after sustaining punctures that would disable conventional tires. The space industry has pushed rubber technology into realms that would have been inconceivable during Goodyear's lifetime. Spacecraft seals must function flawlessly at temperatures reaching -450 degrees Fahrenheit, while resisting radiation levels that would destroy most materials within hours. The vacuum of space creates additional challenges, as conventional materials can outgas chemicals that contaminate sensitive instruments or damage electronic systems. Aerospace engineers have responded by developing rubber compounds that incorporate exotic additives like carbon nanotubes and graphene, creating materials that maintain elasticity under conditions more extreme than those found anywhere on Earth. Mars rover wheels demonstrate these advances in practical application, using specially formulated rubber that remains flexible despite temperature fluctuations from -190 degrees Fahrenheit during Martian winter nights to +70 degrees Fahrenheit during summer days, all while withstanding constant bombardment by cosmic radiation. Perhaps most remarkably, scientists have begun developing bio-based rubber alternatives that address environmental concerns, while often exceeding the performance of conventional materials. Bacterial rubber, produced by genetically modified microorganisms, demonstrates enhanced elasticity and temperature resistance compared to traditional petroleum-based synthetics. These biological alternatives offer the tantalizing possibility of creating rubber from renewable sources while reducing the environmental impact that has shadowed the industry since its earliest days. Dandelions, those humble weeds that populate suburban lawns around the world, have emerged as an unexpected source of high-quality rubber. Russian dandelions produce latex with properties remarkably similar to tropical rubber trees, but they can be cultivated in temperate climates using sustainable farming practices. Researchers are developing dandelion varieties optimized for latex production, potentially creating rubber sources that don't require tropical deforestation or the labor-intensive cultivation methods that have characterized traditional rubber production. Guayuli shrubs, native to the southwestern United States and northern Mexico, represent another promising biological alternative. These hardy plants can produce rubber in arid environments unsuitable for most agriculture, offering the possibility of rubber cultivation that actually improves degraded landscapes rather than destroying pristine ecosystems. The latex they produce can be processed using techniques derived directly from Goodyear's original vulcanization methods, demonstrating how 19th century discoveries continue to enable 21st century innovations. The electronic revolution has created entirely new applications for rubber technology that extend far beyond its traditional roles. Conductive rubber enables flexible electronics that can bend and stretch without losing functionality, opening possibilities for wearable computers, flexible displays, and electronic textiles that integrate seamlessly with human activity. Smartphone cases made from specialized rubber compounds provide impact protection while maintaining the precise tactile sensitivity required for touchscreen operation. Wearable medical devices demonstrate rubber's evolving role in healthcare technology. Heart monitors embedded in clothing use biocompatible rubber that maintains continuous contact with skin while remaining comfortable for extended wear. These devices can track vital signs for days or weeks, providing medical professionals with unprecedented insight into patient health patterns while using materials that trace their lineage directly to Goodyear's accidental discovery. Earthquake-resistant building foundations represent one of rubber's most important modern applications, using massive rubber isolators that allow buildings to flex during seismic events without suffering structural damage. These systems incorporate thousands of individual rubber elements, each precisely engineered to absorb and dissipate earthquake energy while supporting enormous structural loads. The molecular crosslinks that Goodyear discovered enable buildings to dance with earthquakes rather than fighting forces that would otherwise destroy them. Quantum computer components operate at temperatures approaching absolute zero, creating conditions where conventional materials become brittle as glass. Specialized rubber compounds maintain flexibility even at these extreme temperatures, enabling the precise mechanical adjustments necessary for quantum computers to function reliably. These applications push the boundaries of materials science into realms where the distinction between physics and engineering becomes beautifully blurred. Perhaps most importantly, modern rubber science has begun addressing the environmental challenges that have shadowed the industry throughout its history. Recycling technologies now enable used tires to be broken down into their molecular components and reformed into new products, creating closed-loop systems that dramatically reduce waste. Advanced chemical processes can separate vulcanized rubber into its constituent polymers, allowing materials to be reused indefinitely without loss of performance. Sustainable plantation management techniques developed through ecological research are beginning to restore some of the biodiversity that monoculture rubber cultivation destroyed. Agroforestry systems integrate rubber trees with other species, creating plantation ecosystems that support wildlife while maintaining commercial productivity. These approaches demonstrate that human needs and environmental protection can coexist when guided by scientific understanding of ecological relationships. The molecular principles that Charles Goodyear accidentally discovered in his kitchen laboratory continue to surprise researchers with new possibilities. Recent advances in polymer chemistry have enabled the development of rubber materials that can conduct electricity, emit light, or change color in response to environmental conditions. These smart materials suggest applications in everything from infrastructure monitoring to interactive architectural surfaces. Biomedical researchers are exploring rubber's potential for tissue engineering applications, where materials must integrate with living systems while providing mechanical properties that match natural tissues. Artificial blood vessels made from specially formulated rubber could provide alternatives to biological grafts for patients requiring cardiac surgery, using materials that can function reliably for decades within the human body. Looking toward the future, rubber's evolution continues to accelerate as new scientific tools enable precise control over molecular structure and properties. Computational chemistry allows researchers to design rubber compounds with specific characteristics before synthesizing them in laboratories, dramatically reducing the time required to develop new materials. Artificial intelligence systems can predict how different chemical modifications will affect rubber's behavior, enabling innovations that would have required decades of experimental work just a few years ago. The legacy of Charles Goodyear's accidental discovery extends far beyond the material achievements it enabled. His story demonstrates the power of persistence in the face of repeated failure, the importance of systematic observation, even in the midst of apparent chaos, and the profound way that individual curiosity can reshape human civilization. From a desperate man's kitchen, experiments has emerged a technology that touches virtually every aspect of modern life. As we face the challenges of the 21st century, climate change, resource scarcity, aging infrastructure, medical needs of growing populations, OBAC, rubber science continues to provide solutions that honor both human ingenuity and environmental responsibility. The molecular crosslinks that Goodyear discovered by accident have become the foundation for materials that help build a more sustainable future. In laboratories around the world, researchers continue to explore rubber's potential, discovering new applications that extend its reach into realms that Goodyear could never have imagined. Yet at its heart, every breakthrough still relies on the fundamental insight that emerged from that February morning's accident, CS. That molecular crosslinks can transform materials in ways that seem magical but follow the elegant logic of chemistry. The story that began with indigenous peoples recognizing rubber's gifts continued through Goodyear's desperate experiments and expanded into global industry has no ending. It continues to evolve, demonstrating that the greatest discoveries often emerge not from grand plans, but from careful observation, persistent effort, and the wisdom to recognize when accident reveals nature's deeper truths.